The House will please come to order. Welcome, members. As you might notice, we have a few committees still out, or two maybe, still doing work. So we're going to hold off on the roll. So first we'll start with our prayer of the day, and we're joined today by Father August of the Cathedral of St. Mary.
Okay. This is St. Paul's letter to the Romans 15:13 on trust. May the God of hope fill you all with joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Let us pray. Lord, help us to trust in your great love for each of us. We know that your love casts out all fear. Your love gives us courage to face our day-by-day struggles, and it helps us to face all difficulties with peace and even death itself. Lord, help us to trust in your great love so that it can guide and inspire the work we do in this chamber. Help us to have an open heart toward each other, even when we disagree, so that we can better serve the people here in Wyoming. Amen.
Thank you, Father. Please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you very much, Father August. We look forward to the rest of the week with you. Enjoy the day. So members, we are in our 15th day of the 66th Wyoming Legislature General Session, Monday, March 8th. And we're still short a few members, but they're starting to filter in. So we'll just Chief Clerk, let's go ahead and do the roll. I think by the time they all get here, we'll be set. Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Convening roll call for the 15th day, Monday, March 8th, 2021. Andrew. Baker. Banks. Bear. Blackburn. Brown. Burkhart. Burt. Clausen. Clifford. Connolly. Crago. Duncan. Eklund. Air. Flitner. Fortner. Gray. Greer. Hallinan. Haroldson. Harshman. Heiner. Henderson. Hunt. Jennings. Kenner.
Here.
Knapp. Larson Lloyd. Larson Dan. McGuire. Martinez. Nyman. Newsom. Nicholas. Oakley. Obermuller. O'Hearn. Olson. Ottman. Paxton. Provenza. Roscoe. Schwartz. Sherwood. Simpson. Summers. Stith. Stivar. Sweeney. Walters. Washit. Western. Wharf. Williams. Wilson. Winter. Yin. Zwanitzer. Mr. Speaker. Obermueller. Duncan. Air.
Chief Clerk, let's leave the roll open just a little longer. We've certainly established we have a quorum, so we can continue with our business. Just for the members that are here and folks in the gallery and listening in, maybe across the World Wide Web, we have committees hard at work this morning on a Monday morning, and they might have got a little engrossed in their work and forgot to, we gavel in at 10 o'clock. So with that, Journal Committee report.
Your Journal Committee reports that the Journal of March 5th, 2021 has been read and recommends that it be approved. Representative Haroldson.
Thank you very much. So members, at this time, I'm going to introduce House Bill 1, which per rule goes directly to the floor to Committee of the Whole. And then this afternoon, we'll introduce about another 10 or so bills that members have requested be introduced. So don't panic on me. We'll do an introduction here later in the day. So House Bill 1. Reading clerk.
House Bill 1, sponsored by Appropriations.
First reading of the bill.
General Government Appropriations 2.
Pursuant to Joint Rule 4-1-2, House Bill 1 is referred to Committee of the Whole. So members, just to clarify, that's what we begin when we're completed with third reading today. Explanation of Committee of the Whole, in Committee of the Whole of House Bill 1. I just want to remind the members, and certainly for the audience joining us here in the gallery and across this world, there are no amendments on Committee of the Whole or first reading of the budget bill. It'll just be explanation, a time for you to ask questions of our good Appropriations Committee and the work that they've done. So that's just a reminder of what the process will be. Reports from standing committees.
Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 4 Education, to whom is referred House Bill 173, School Finance Funding 2. Respectful report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Brown, Harshman, Newsom, Paxton, Summers. Noes, Representatives Andrew, Connolly, Nyman, Obermueller. Representative Paxton, Chairman. Mr. Speaker, your Committee Number 9, Minerals, Business and Economic Development, to whom is referred House Bill 170, Wyoming Economic Development Zones. Respectful report, same back to the House with the recommendation that it do pass with the following amendments. Ayes, Representatives Bear, Burkhart, Duncan, Air, Gray, Greer, Heiner, Sherwood. Excused, Representative Western. Representative Greer, Chairman.
Thank you very much. So we're just going to pause just for a minute. We have a committee coming in and we'll complete our roll call here. Just a moment. We get a few more of the members coming in. Chief Clerk, if you want to call the ones you see as they come in, that'd be great.
Greer. Burt. Crago. Larson Dan. Oakley. Yin. Williams. Zwanitzer.
Let's just excuse him. Go ahead. Finish it.
Olson,
Excused.
Provenza,
Excused.
Washit,
Excused.
Worf,
Excused.
Williams. We have 56 present, 4 are excused.
Thank you, Chief Clerk. I think we have a privilege of the floor. Representative Duncan.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was going to use up a little bit of time, so I'll be really brief. For those new members, the CSG is Council of the Western States Government, and it is a great privilege and resource for information. And they have a legislative academy every December 7th through the 10th. And I just want to give you a heads up that applications are due April 23rd. Come see me, and some of those, please raise your hand on the floor if you've attended. Take a look around, new members, and look at those with their hands up. Those are the people that have attended, and please grab one of them and ask them about the academy and how wonderful it is. And those applications are due April 23rd, and any number of those people and your neighbors would be willing to write a letter of reference for you. And there's also now in July 7th, I believe, that there is a special meeting this is all in Colorado Springs. And it's a great event. And there is going to be a special Zoom online meeting to introduce you to the people and just give you a heads up of what's going on. So I will meet with all of you guys and try and get you to introduce you to the people at CSG West and give you a little heads up. So watch for that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. So members, just as a bit of a follow-up, as you know, the Wyoming legislatures affiliates with 2 organizations, that being one of them. And so there's lots of good opportunities to expand both your legislative and your network of folks that might be interested in similar legislative things in other states. So take advantage of those if you're so inclined. We're at that order of bills on second reading. The first bill for our consideration is House Bill 33.
Interference with public contracting. House Bill 33, sponsored by Judiciary. Oh, we do that? An act relating to crimes and offenses.
Thank you, Reading Clerk. We do have an amendment. Representative Stiff.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I would move second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 33 and ask for your favorable consideration. Members, I apologize to bring this to you. These are all clerical changes to essentially clean up the grammar and to make sure that it does what we intend it to do. Starting on page 8, the current language reads that it's a crime if a public servant insists or that a specified person be a subcontractor on a project. Right now it says individuals. This amendment would change it to persons so that it would include, companies that are also subcontractors. So that's a cleanup. Page 11 deals with kickbacks or bribery of an inspector. I apologize. We had language originally that limited this crime of bribing an inspector merely to someone who's employed by a prime contractor or a subcontractor. But as we thought about it, the inspector might be employed by the municipality, for example, or the state agency. So to clean that up, it's simpler to simply delete who the person is employed by and simply say that if you bribe an inspector, that's a crime, period. And then finally, the last series of changes are on bottom of page 12, top of page 13. Initially, the idea is what happens if a person is convicted of one of these offenses. The section here provides for a 3-year bar on that person to bid on public contracts. But there's an exception in the event that it's just a bad apple and an otherwise good company. But when we described companies, we described it as a partnership or a corporation only. And so that leaves out, for example, limited liability companies. And so what we've done here is just add in the word company. So now the phrase in 4 different spots, instead of saying partnership or corporation, says partnership, company, or corporation. So again, I think these are, again, cleanup amendments that don't change the substance or the intent of the bill, but rather fix the word choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Stith. Members, we're on second reading, so second reading of speaking rules. Anybody else, anybody for their first time? First time. Seeing no one moving to the mic, we're voting on second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 33. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. The motion is adopted. House Bill 33, having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Next bill for our consideration is House Bill 73.
Birth certificates, gestational agreements, an act relating to vital records.
We do have an amendment. Chairman Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 73. Ask for your favorable consideration. When I presented the bill, I said I would bring an amendment requiring that the intended parents be a resident of the state of Wyoming 1 year prior to the execution of the agreement. That's what this amendment is delivering on that comment to you. Some sideboards to deal with the concern of Wyoming setting up a cottage industry in this realm. I think it's there for the intended purpose I brought it was to help Wyoming families be able to navigate through this process if they so choose to use it without the added court expense and fees associated with the current process. Also brings some consistency. I appreciate the co-sponsor on this amendment, who I know is not going to support the bill, but it's a good thing for him to help put some sideboards on it. And I think that's how we work together, and I do appreciate that. So that explanation, I'd ask for an aye vote.
Any other member for the first time? Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I completely appreciate the intent. I just need some more clarification on how it's going to work and make sure I understand. So this is just on the intended parents, not on who's carrying the child, which would make sense because then you're going to get the birth certificate in Wyoming under Wyoming law. But at what point do you have to prove the agreement? Because right now, if I understand it, you don't have to go prove your residency when you start the agreement. You'd have to prove that residency upon birth of the child when you got the birth certificate, which would be assumedly 9 months, if not more. And then so you were a resident a year before that 9 months period. So you're basically, when you go to get the birth certificate, you show them a copy of the agreement and then prove you were a resident 2 years previously for both parents. It just seems really cumbersome and odd to me the way I'm reading it. So if the good presenter of the amendment could clear up my trepidation there.
Thank you. Any other member for their first time? First time on second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 73. Any other member for their first time? First time, second time to the sponsor, Chairman Greer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so to help answer that, clear up that question, within the bill, it's part of, says the Department of Vital Records will issue a birth certificate when this gestational agreement is filed with them, and that it meets these requirements. And this is one of the additional requirements. And that's why I use the term at the time the agreement is signed, meaning within that agreement, they will have proof of residency within that agreement. And that should help answer that question and make it no more cumbersome and keep it a smooth process. Mr. Speaker, I was reluctant to use the term residency, proof of residency.
All right, members, we're voting on second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 73. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment is adopted. House Bill 73, having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection is so ordered. Speaker Pro Tem, when you are available. Speaker Pro Tem Greer, when you're available, you come to the front and, because I have an amendment coming up pretty soon. Next bill for our consideration is House Bill 101.
Elk feeding ground closings, an act relating to elk feeding grounds.
House Bill 101, having been read two separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection is so ordered.
Where are we? Okay. Speaker Barlow. Oh. Our next bill for our consideration. Oh, okay. Next bill for our consideration is House Bill 102.
House Bill 102, sponsored by Representative Barlow, Wyoming Preference Act of 1971 amendments, an act relating to Wyoming Preference Act of 1971.
We have an amendment. Okay, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. So members, we learned it takes lots of good eyes on bills to make them better. And I want to thank one of my colleagues for pointing out that the list that that the bill establishes was you had to meet all of those qualifications, not one or the next or the next or the next. There's two ways to do that. You can put an or in, somewhere down, or we're going to do it what this amendment says, and I'd ask for your favorable consideration is you just say any of the following requirements. So I thank my good colleagues for pointing out the omission and giving me an opportunity to correct it. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to stand for any questions.
Good. Anyone for the first time? Okay, seeing that? No one? Question on, we're on second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 102. All those in favor? Excuse me? Hold on, just hold on, folks. Go ahead,
Mr.
Mr.
Speaker Pro
Speaker.
Tem, if there's any question that I did not move it, which I may not have, I would like to move second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 102 and ask for your favorable consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Okay, now, anyone for the first time? Seeing no one, question being called. We are on first or second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 102. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Amendment has been adopted. House Bill 102 having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be heard a third time? Hearing no objection is so ordered. Okay. All right. The next bill for our consideration is House Bill 104.
House Bill 104, sponsored by Representative Greer. Uniform Trust Code Amendments, an act relating to trusts.
House Bill 104 having been read 2 separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Next bill for our consideration is House Bill 121.
House Bill 121, sponsored by Appropriations, State-Funded Capital Construction, an act relating to state-funded capital construction.
Okay. House Bill 121 having been read 2 separate times. The question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. The next bill for our consideration is House Bill 133.
House Bill 133, sponsored by Representative Walters. Online sports wagering, an act relating to online sports wagering.
Okay, I'm showing 3 separate amendments. Representative Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. I do move second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 133 and do ask for your favorable consideration. So this deals with the fines portion of the bill, deals with the fines that a a company would be imposed if it operated without authority or licensure in the state of Wyoming. That fine was set at $5,000 and $10,000. All this amendment does is bump that up to 25,000 and bump it up to 50,000. For those of you who are familiar with this bill, this was an amendment we had a year ago on the bill. For those of you that are newer, I mean, the logic here is just simply, as you've heard testimony, most of these operators are very large operators. So
Okay.
at least in my mind, I don't even know that this is probably it's just, I don't know that that's a big enough dollar amount for some of the size of the operators, but the idea is, if you're a multi-billion-dollar company and you want to operate illegally in the state of Wyoming, if this were to become law and we impose a $5,000 penalty, what does that really do? So that's the logic here, is just to try to add just a little bit more, even though I think the bill is really well crafted in terms of public and consumer protection in Wyoming. This is just an attempt to add just a little bit more flavor of that to it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Flintner?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem. If I could just ask the good chairman bringer of the amendment about the enforcement aspect. Can you just speak to me how this would be, how would you discover if someone was accepting a wager without the permitting in place? Just, if you could just kind of spell that out for me. Thank you.
Anyone else for their first time? First time? Second time? Second time before the sponsor? Okay. Chairman Olson.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So really, I think there's two different classes of accepting wages or bets without licensure that we're looking at. One is on your phone in your house. And I think that's what you're speaking to, the good chairman, that how do we know that's going to happen? How do we enforce that? I'm actually more focused on a different type of offense that I think this body should be more concerned with. To me, that seems like an odd concern, to be concerned with the individual in their home who's simply just playing on their phone. I'm concerned with the operators who violate one of the other provisions that came in on a committee of the whole amendment to prohibit brick and mortar operations. And that's really where I'm focused. I think what you don't want is to see these pop up in your local communities or an existing bar or establishment where the owner of the establishment puts a tablet down on the bar and says, everyone who wants to come bet, come bet. And that's the type of activity that I think would be easy to catch in the state of Wyoming. And that's the type of activity, at least from my perspective, I would like to prohibit, is those brick and mortar shops. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, we are voting on second reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 33. All those in favor say aye. Opposed? Amendment has been adopted. We are now on second reading amendment number 2 to House Bill 133. Sorry, Representative
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would
Walters. I'm sorry, your name just left me. Representative Walters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would respectfully withdraw second reading amendment number 2 to House Bill 133. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Second reading amendment number 2 to House Bill 133 has been withdrawn. We are now on second reading amendment number 3 to House Bill 133. Okay, Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, thank you. And I'd like to move second reading amendment number 3 to House Bill 133 and ask for your favorable consideration. So we had a really good debate on this bill on the effects of gambling on society. And so what I wanted to ensure is that some of the money that was would be carved out of this specifically for prevention efforts. So as we know, right now we have local county health officers that have prevention programs in each county, because that's part of a system in Wyoming. It's really not related to gambling. It's more alcohol abuse and substance abuse. and suicide prevention. But we have the people in place, and I think it would be good if we had some money set aside to send to the counties for basically gambling addiction prevention. So that's the idea behind this, is to carve out some money for that purpose. Thank you.
Any members for the first time? Representative Stith.
Mr. Chairman, just a question for the bringer of the amendment. Is there some reason that it's $100,000 instead of being 25,000 or 250,000 or some other number? Thank you.
Representative Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm in favor of this amendment. I do find it interesting, though, that we're acknowledging by creating this program, we're automatically throwing $100,000 per year into state, local programs in order to help resolve the addiction problem. But still in favor of, I think we're acknowledging it. Let's put some money where in the local areas we can deal with it. Thank you.
Any other members for the first time? Okay, go ahead, Representative Zwanzer.
Thank you,
Chairman
Mr. Chairman.
Zwanzer.
I just want to make sure that this amendment mirrors the language we have in trying not to use a proper name here. On the Lottery Commission, we did in that statute incorporate a fund to treat gaming addiction as well. And I want to make sure it's going to the same place and the same division, and just ensuring the crafter of this amendment is anticipating it going to one fund, or if we're going to have two separate problem gaming funds in statute.
Okay, any other members for the first time? Okay, any members for the second time? Oh, Representative Walters. So, okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a good idea, but I'd also offer that when we convert individuals in this activity from the unregulated market and illegal market to the regulated market posts right up front how to access these sorts of services. They also have know your customer databases that make sure that allow you to not to set limits for yourself, allow you to prevent yourself from getting in over your head, and actually shut your account down if they think you're getting in over your head. And that is the beauty of a regulated market that the illegal market does not offer. The illegal market will continue to take your money until it's all gone. The regulated market steps up, does things right, and makes sure that you're allowed to participate and have fun and enjoy yourself, but not do it to a point that you take away from yourself. And so that is the beauty of this entire bill, is it creates that regulatory framework. And so I think this is a good idea. I appreciate the bringer and would encourage your support.
Okay, any other members for the first time? Chairman Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quick, I heard from a couple constituents this weekend. There were mixed martial arts fights this weekend. I don't ever watch that. I'm an old boxing fan, but and so I learned more about it, but they basically changed their location on their computer, the VPN, and then they have full access to these apps in our state. Lord knows how many hundreds of thousands were bet across our state this weekend. Totally unregulated. Money doesn't come here, but some of these problems that this amendment might try to address are. And so I think regulation is going to be really key. I voted against every gambling initiative from day one when I was elected, and I've lost. I mean, eventually we've but I think if the will of the people represented by this body is to move in that direction, then I think you regulate it and you do those things to make sure it's done to protect our people to the greatest extent possible. For some folks that'll have trouble, no doubt. But anyway, so it's going on. Vote this bill down. It's going to go on the black market, and it's going to continue to increase. And I think at some point we got to regulate it. So on and for the amendment and for the bill. Thank you.
Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a person who has 12 plus years of gaming experience and worked her way up to be second in command at one of our casino properties, I'm on and for this amendment. However, I worry about the appropriation. Being in gambling and being a gambling tribe, we created a counseling program at our casino. 7 full-time counselors to work with problem gambling, but also other addictions. And studies show when you have an addiction, it usually affects other addictions. You substitute one addiction for the other. And our counseling program cost us $300,000 a year. And so I would just urge, is this enough of appropriation to adequately address the problems that come with gambling? Thank you.
Any other members for the first time? Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up with the good representative's comments about our tribal relations. And I'm for the amendment, but this bill in whole may take away from some of the revenue from our tribes with their activities on the reservation. As I researched this and in the other 9 states that have already approved online gambling, most of those states had to make concessions with the tribe. And my question is, have we consulted with the tribes to make sure that we're not going to hurt their business? And do we need to do something to prevent that from hurting the sovereign nation of our tribe?
Members, just try to stay on the subject of the amendment. We'll have opportunity on third reading if we want to openly debate the bill again. So anyone else for their first time on amendment number 3? Anybody for their second time? Second time before the sponsor? Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, thank you. And so to the good representative who lives to the south of me, no, there's no magic in this number. I kind of chose it just kind of random, not so random, but I thought it was a good amount. To the good chair of corporations, I specifically, for an intended reason, put it in a different place. And that reason is we already have these prevention specialists scattered in every county that work with all kinds of interests. And I really thought this would be a good way to get some gambling addiction out into every county versus maybe a statewide program that was set up during the other time. So no, I did do it differently and differently for a reason. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and support.
Okay. Members, we are voting on second reading amendment number 3 to House Bill 133. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed? An amendment is adopted. House Bill 133 having been read 2 separate times, the question is, shall the bill be read a third time? Hearing no objection, is so ordered. Mr. Speaker.
We are at that order of business on third reading and final passage. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move the consent list consisting of the following bills. House Bill 10, 46, 65, 76, 85, 87, 103, 135, and 148.
Would any member like any of the bills listed removed from the consent list? Would any member like a bill removed from the consent list? Seeing none, will the reading clerk please read the bills on the consent list?
House Bill 10, sponsored by Minerals, COVID-19 Large Business Relief Program, an act relating to the emergency expenses of government related to business relief, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 46, sponsored by Representative Stith, crime of bestiality, an act relating to crimes and offenses, being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 65, sponsored by Representative Larson Lloyd. Political subdivisions, deposits. An act relating to public funds being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 76, sponsored by Representative Brown. Uniform statewide payment processing, an act relating to the administration of government. House Bill 85, sponsored by Representative Stith. Unlawful dissemination of an intimate image, an act relating to crimes and offenses being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 87, sponsored by Appropriations. Provider Recruitment Grant Program repeal, an act relating to the Provider Recruitment Grant Program being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 103, sponsored by Representative Zwanitzer. Journalists' Privileged Communications, an act relating to civil and criminal procedures being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 135, sponsored by Representative Henderson. Hank Cole Leadership Highway Designation, an act relating to highways being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming. House Bill 148, sponsored by Appropriations. Fees paid to Secretary of State amendments, an act relating to fees paid through the Office of the Secretary of State, be enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
Having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall these bills pass? Chief Clerk will call the roll.
Roll call on the consent list. Andrew. Baker. Banks. Bear. Blackburn. Brown. Burkhart. Burt. Clausen. Clifford. Connolly. Crago. Duncan. Eklund. Air. Flitner. Fortner. Gray. Greer. Hallinan. Haroldson. Harshman. Heiner. Henderson. Hunt. Jennings. Kenner.
Aye.
Knapp. Larson Lloyd. Larson Dan. McGuire. Martinez. Nyman. Newsom. Nicholas. Oakley. Obermuller. O'Hearn. Olson. Ottman. Paxton. Provenza. Roscoe. Schwartz. Sherwood. Simpson. Summers. Stith. Stivar. Sweeney. Walters. Washit. Western. Wharf. Williams. Wilson. Winter. Yin. Zwanitzer. Mr. Speaker, we have 60 aye. As for House Bill 10, are there any changes? Gray, aye to no. Clausen, aye to no. Provenza, aye to no. Nyman, aye to no. Haroldson, aye to no. Burt, aye to no. Heiner, aye to no. Wharf, aye to no. Williams, aye to no. Yin, aye to no. Schwartz, aye to no. Larson Dan, aye to no. Fortner, aye to no. Baker, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Blackburn, aye to no. Greer, aye. Greer, conflict. Hallinan, aye to no. Knapp, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Further changes, Ottman, aye to no. Washit, aye to no. Further changes, Martinez, aye to no. Further changes, closing vote. Vote is closed. 35 aye, 24 no, 1 conflict. As for House Bill 46, are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote is closed. 60 aye. As for House Bill 65, are there any changes? Paxton, aye to no. Henderson, aye to no. Burkhart, aye to no. Walters, aye to no. Crago, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. For Fortner? Fortner, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 53 aye, 7 no. As for House Bill 76, are there any changes? Let me see. As for House Bill 76, are there any changes? Gray, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. Fortner, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 56 aye, 4 no. As for House Bill 85, are there any changes? Are there any changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 60 aye. As for House Bill 87, are there any changes? Larson Dan, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Fortner, aye to no. Henderson, aye to no. Further changes? Ottman, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 55 aye, 5 no. As for House Bill 103, are there any changes? Gray, aye to no. Washut, aye to no. Heiner, aye to no. Burkhart, aye to no. Worf, aye to no. Blackburn, aye to no. Haroldson, aye to no. Nyman, aye to no. Hunt, aye to no. Clausen, aye to no. Williams, aye to no. Knapp, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Larson Dan, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Fortner, aye to no. Baker, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Greer, aye to no. Walters, aye to no. Nicholas, aye to no. Ottman, aye to no. Martinez, aye to no. Western, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 37 aye, 23 no. As for House Bill 135, are there any changes? Larson Dan, aye to no. Stivar, aye to no. Jennings, aye to no. Fortner, aye to no. Bear, aye to no. Ottman, aye to no. Further changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 54 aye, 6 no. As for House Bill 148, are there any changes? Gray, aye to no. Heiner, aye to no. Worf, aye to no. Williams, aye to no. Burt, aye to no. Blackburn, aye to no. Haroldson, aye to no. Nyman, aye to no. Andrew, aye to no. Ottman, aye to no. Winter, aye to no. Larson Dan, aye to no. Bear, aye to know. Fortner, I to know. Baker, I to know. Jennings, I to know. Stibar, I to know. Further changes? Closing vote? The vote is closed. 45 aye, 15 no. I've got to put it in, so just give me a second.
So members, we'll just stand at ease just for a moment. There was one of the bills, 65, that was not in the order when the chief clerk went through it. So 65 still remains to be the final vote. All right, so we verified that there was a roll on 65, so I apologize. There were very few changes, so that's what got me off track. So having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, House Bill 10, 46, 65, 76, 85, 87, 103, 135, and 148 have passed the House. We're now in that order of business of bills on third reading regular. First bill for our consideration is House Bill 17.
House Bill 17, sponsored by Transportation, Range Management at Military Training Areas, an act relating to the military department being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
We do have an amendment. Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would move third reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 17 and ask for your favorable consideration. If you'll remember, we had a second reading amendment that stripped out the appropriation completely. This was honestly, I think this might even be just a hair too much money, but this was a good compromise by myself and the majority floor leader to put in $50,000 to allow the military department to execute these contracts. So would urge an aye vote. Just gives the military department the amount of money needed in order to execute these contracts and get this program up and running.
Any member for their first time? First time. Any member for their first time? Seeing none, second time. Members, we're voting on third reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 17. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment has been adopted. House Bill 17, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Andrew. Baker. Banks. Bear. Blackburn. Brown. Burkhart. Burt. Clausen. Clifford. Connolly. Crago. Duncan. Eklund. Air. Fletner. Fortner. Gray. Greer. Hallinan. Haroldson. Harshman. Heiner. Henderson. Hunt. Jennings. Kenner.
Aye.
Knapp. Larson Lloyd. Larson Dan. McGuire. Martinez. Nyman. Newsom. Nicholas. Oakley. Obermuller. O'Hearn. Olson. Ottman. Paxton. Provenza. Roscoe. Schwartz. Sherwood. Simpson. Summers. Stith. Stibar. Sweeney. Walters. Washit. Western. Wharf. Williams. Wilson. Winter. Yin. Zwanitzer. Mr. Speaker. Closing vote. Are there any changes? Flitner. Aye to no. Crago. Aye to no. Andrew. Aye to no. Stiff. No to aye. Further changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 38 aye, 22 no.
House Bill 17, having been read 3 separate times, having received the affirmative vote of the majority of the members elected to the House, House Bill 17 has passed the House. Next bill for our consideration is House Bill 118.
House Bill 118, sponsored by Representative Duncan. Food Freedom Act amendments, an act relating to marketing homemade foods, be it enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
We do have an amendment. Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will move third reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 118 and ask for your favorable consideration. So friends, this is something that I did want to bring in second reading, and I do apologize for waiting until third reading. I wasn't feeling up to it on Friday. But my concern was in our committee of the whole amendment, where we talk about making it so we ensure that it's not more restrictive than any applicable federal requirements, and it's not more restrictive than the maximum extent permitted by federal law. So the thing is, I don't know all of federal law. I'll admit that straight out. I don't know all of federal law. And my concern becomes if we allow federal law to allow things that we wouldn't necessarily allow in our state law. So for example, just last year in our Food Freedom Amendment, we defined what a producer was to make sure that it's under a certain amount of money or under a certain amount of products. And if there is federal law that says we can't, that allows anyone to be a producer instead of our definition of a producer, it would open the door. So that's why I brought in this amendment, to just make it very tailored to the egg portion of what this bill is specifically for, which is allowing eggs. So that's all the amendment is. I do want egg freedom, so it's narrowly restricted to egg freedom. And so I do ask for your favorable consideration, and I will be happy to answer any questions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Anyone else for their first time? Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On and against the amendment. And this is why. In the amendment, we talk about that we are talking about the producers and the drink product. That is the first line in the Food Freedom Bill. So all we're doing is we're reflecting back to the idea of the Food Freedom Act. So all we're doing is we're referencing our Food Freedom Act. So we don't need to mess with our intent of our bill. So please, let's just move on for egg freedom. On and against the amendment.
Anyone else for the first time? Chairman Swanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the amendment, I'm going to vote for the bill either way, but I just want to make sure we're clear. I mean, my name's on the bill and I co-sponsored it because it was dealing with one certain subject. The committee of the whole opened it up to much, much larger than I ever anticipated, and I don't exactly know what we're doing. So I support the amendment. I support the bill. If I was on my A game, I probably would have called the rules on committee of the whole on the amendment, but it's too late now because I do think what we did expanded unknowingly how far we've gone. So the amendment tightens it back up, puts it solely on eggs, and I would encourage your support.
Any other member for their first time? We're on third reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 118. Any member for their first time? Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I urge the body to reject this amendment. I think the second reading amendment that was brought forward did a good job of clearly delineating those boundaries between state and federal level, and I worry that this amendment would kind of muddy those waters. The entire point of the bill was to honor the Food Freedom Act. And I think that the bill and the amendment that was brought in the second reading did a good job of tightening it up, making that delineation. So I urge the body to reject this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member for their first time? First time. Any member for their first time? Second time before the sponsor. Second time before the sponsor. To the sponsor, Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to read the language from the Committee of the Whole amendment that I am amending, which is may sell homemade food and drink products or eggs to the maximum extent permitted by federal law. And then again, which is almost even broader of a sentence than the last sentence, nothing in this article shall be construed to be more restrictive than applicable federal requirements. So if federal requirements are silent on the matter on any specific subject in our Food Freedom Act, where we may be tighter, like specifically for the definition of producers, it opens the door unnecessarily. And again, I'm not an expert in all federal law, but I worry that we don't want to open the door to allow the feds to decide what is and isn't permitted when that's something that we should be deciding. So I'll urge you again to vote for the amendment, and I thank you for your consideration. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Members, we are voting on third reading amendment number 1 to House Bill 118. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. The chair is in doubt. All those in favor, please stand. Those opposed? More than 25. My apologies. I'm off calibration. So the amendment has failed. House Bill 118, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Andrew. Baker. Banks. Bear. Blackburn. Brown. Burkhart. Burt. Clausen. Clifford. Connolly. Crago. Duncan. Eklund. Air. Flitner. Fortner. Gray. Greer. Hallinan. Haroldson. Harshman. Heiner. Henderson. Hunt. Jennings. Kenner.
Aye.
Knapp. Larson Lloyd. Larson Dan. McGuire. Martinez. Nyman. Newsom. Nicholas. Nicholas. Oakley. Obermuller. O'Hearn. Olson. Ottman. Paxton. Provenza. Roscoe. Schwartz. Sherwood. Simpson. Summers. Stith. Stivar. Sweeney. Walters. Washit. Western. Wharf. Williams. Wilson. Winter. Yin. Swanitzer. Mr. Speaker. Nicholas. Closing vote. Are there any changes? Closing vote. Vote is closed. 55 aye, 5 no.
House Bill 118, having received the affirmative vote of the members elected to the House, House Bill 118 has passed the House. Next bill for consideration is House Joint Resolution 3.
House Joint Resolution 3, sponsored by Representative Hallinan. State lands, mineral royalties, a joint resolution proposing to amend the Wyoming Constitution to provide that 2/3 of the state mineral royalties earned from the lease of state school lands may be appropriated by the legislature for the support of the schools, public schools for 6 years and providing ballot statement being enacted by the legislature of the state of Wyoming.
We do have an amendment. Chairman Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'd move third reading amendment number 1 to House Joint Resolution 3 and ask for your favorable consideration. Members, if you could open your email, it's probably the second or third one down. I sent it to the whole house here just a couple minutes ago, so it'd be timely. And then if you would open that attachment, normally those would be delivered. You right at your front box on your desk. And then I would stand here and I'd say, it looks like this. So if you can open that onto your screen, you'll have that. And I'll just pause for a minute. I do think a picture's worth 1,000 words, might be worth 5,000 words in this deal. Okay, Mr. Speaker, really what this amendment does, I'm not tinkering with the good representative from Campbell County's amendment. His amendment is to pull, remember we had this debate. Currently, the Constitution allows 1/3 to be used for the school children each year. We've been doing that fully now for the last 4 years, once we discovered that $8 million cap that was placed on it. The good representative from Campbell County wants to use an additional 2/3 that would go to the permanent fund for the next 6 years, about 30+ million a year. I think we might support it. I told you all those reasons. It'll take 2/3 of us here in a minute when we vote. So then I tried to split it, did that, got beat down on that. So I thought, what do we really want to do with this? I mean, as we solve this problem now, what are we looking at in the future? And so when you try to solve these problems, you got to have an eye out here a little bit on the horizon, how we can solve this. And really part of our deal in Capital Finance Committee, we're trying to move this tremendous wealth of the state. First of all, to make sure it's really secure, that no politician that comes through state government in any of those 5 elected or any of these could really do any harm to them. And most states have done that, done a pretty good job. Our neighbors, can we say states now, Mr. Speaker? I think we can. South Dakota has done a really good job. Alaska, Utah, others have really done. New Mexico, nice job. We're moving down that path to make these more of an endowment and the governance of them, but I won't get into all that. But what this amendment does, and this is a page right out of your data book. And I mentioned to one new member and asked me a deal. I said this a few years ago when I was in training for some of you members who came in the 64th. I would take that data book and I'd put it under your pillow at night, sleep on it while you're in session. Just let all that absorb into your head. Because once you start, because budgets are people. All this money, it's in the end result is about people and how you can help people and how we can move our state forward. So this is a page out of that book. It's right out of the data book. All the dark bold lines I was able to do on my computer. Took me a little while, but so you can see the 2/3 that is circled. Well, first I'd like you to just start at the top. What's the spending policy amount? The SPA. This is in statute and it talks about the purpose. And we've outlined this in statute. Number 1, consistent, sustainable flow of expenditures over time. Because when you look at our school deficit, $250 a year on operations, and then you've heard those numbers. It grows to $1 billion 6 years from now. That's because investment revenue drops off to 0. That's the way we profiled on the goldenrod, because we don't profile capital gains. We only do interest and dividends, and that's about 2.1%. So we run out of investment revenue. So we're trying to move to this endowment model so we can really accomplish the goal of our statute, consistent, sustainable flow of earnings for expenditure for today's people. That's what it's for. Number 2 there, protection of the corpus of the permanent funds against inflation. That's the problem with this amendment. You take 1/3 of it and you don't put it in the corpus. And the good doctor has shown us that it doesn't hurt the corpus that much for 6 years. We'll have to vote our conscience on that. And then to the extent practical, number 3, increase the earnings available to offset the effects of inflation. That's why we have a spending policy. And if you follow these lines down, Mr. Speaker, and then if you have extra over the spending policy amount, it'll take a hard right, go up through, and once that reserve account is full, it starts tipping into the corpus. This reserve account is full. We would tip, we put a little line in the budget saying we didn't want to tip, but we should be tipping this back in, growing the corpus. And this was 4 years ago. We moved, I won't go into all that, but this was part of the solution. We filled up that reserve account so we could guarantee these investment earnings longer. Now, I'm getting into the weeds here a little bit, but Mr. Speaker, really what we're doing, you can see the Hallinan Amendment, the box, the third goes to the school through 2029. I didn't mess with any of that. But then when we're done in 2029, it goes back to the permanent fund. But it goes into a sub-account of the permanent fund to guarantee up to 5.5% of the SPA. Whatever the legislature decides to SPA. Some people said you should have put that cap at 8. Legislature in the future might decide it should be 8. You know, when I first came in, the legislature was 8. Spending policy amount was 8. Was 13 before that. And we've ratcheted that down, and we're currently at 5, and we're looking to give our current people another pay cut to 4.5. Dumbest bill I ever let survive is when I served and sat in that chair. I regret it. Anyway, hopefully we can reverse that. I think we're on the move that. But so what this would do is move it back into the corpus. It's a permanent and violent, and it can be used then to start guaranteeing spending policies into the future. That's all it does, and it's going to change then the goldenrod over time to give us more stability to accomplish our first goal in statute. So it goes to the permanent fund, can be used for anything. It'll grow the permanent fund, but this box out here in the reserve account, it's invested to make about 2% interest. This big common school permanent land fund corpus, growth and earnings, 5, 6, 7, it's invested for the long time, right? To make maximum growth and earnings. And so it's just smart money management where we can start moving all this into the corpus to invest it long-term. I've talked enough, Mr. Speaker. I'd stand for any questions and appreciate your consideration. And we just got to keep moving down this road because it's going to be an important topic for us over the term of the 66th. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Representative Hallinan for your first time. Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Former Speaker, for this amendment. I think this is an amendment that is very ingenious. It allows the money to be used prior or after the 6 years again, that 1/3 to be used again. He's kind of overcoming the opposition of this body to ending the 6-year amendment. 6 years part of the amendment. I don't really have any problem with this amendment, except that I think it makes the issue very complicated for the voters. When they look at this, I'm afraid they may vote no, because it's complicated and it takes a lot of study even to understand it. So that would be my reason. That would be the only reason I can think of to vote against this amendment. But it may be enough for us to vote against it, because I think it would damage the possibility of the amendment being approved by the people. So for that reason, I guess I have to speak against this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Representative Obermuller for your first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my goals here, since in the 4 years I've been here, I'm looking at this, trying to look at this sheet with the same eyes I did when I first came in. And it is very intimidating. And so one of my goals has been to work at simplification of these. And the chief executive talked about, one checking account and one reserve account. And I fundamentally agree with that idea that we start to simplify. This amendment actually moves in that direction, even though when you look at this, it's very intimidating. Moving forward, if we can build an endowment style look inside the permanent funds that only relates to the income but stabilizes the flow out of those. As we grow the funds, we endow the earnings, and it's all flowing out of one fund. And it'll look so much simpler, but today is not the forum to try to resolve all those issues. So I'm just saying that this amendment does move us in that direction. And as we move forward, this works in our favor. So on and for the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member for their first time, third reading amendment number 1? First time. Representative Henderson, first time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask folks to look at that last sentence, in the red text there, where it provides a provision that that's not going to be encumbered, or it can be, it gives us, I think, as a legislature, more flexibility going forward. And I think that really speaks to my good friend from Campbell County's interest in bringing this in the first place. I think we all have a responsibility to our constituents to help inform them, on some of the complex things that we're dealing with here, of course. And so there's a lot going into a constitutional amendment. But I agree with the idea of simplification, and I really support this because of that last sentence. So I'm on and for this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member for their first time, Representative Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appreciate the work on this. My concern on this guarantee and propping up this guarantee is that you're guaranteeing the 5% of the corpus of the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund, and the earnings might not be there to justify that. And so when we talk about preserving the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund for future generations, providing an avenue to prop up that guarantee when the earnings might not be there, which is my understanding of this. I just have concerns on that. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other member for their first time? We're on third reading amendment number 1. Majority Floor Leader Summers.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. On in support of the amendment. And the last speaker was wrong. This is the common school land account. And so when you guarantee the spend on the common school land account, that goes right into the SFP. So it's pretty direct flow. So you are going to be putting the investment earnings. It's going to guarantee those investment earnings that can go to the SFP. The one qualm with this, is it too complicated for the voter? That'll be a good question for the bringer of the amendment. I support the concept because you're really going to a savings in a sense that can be used to guarantee that amount to this SFP through the common school land account. Remember, we have 2 permanent funds out there, Permanent Mineral Trust Fund and the common school land account. Thank you.
Any other member for their first time? Chairman Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First for a second.
Any other members for their first time? Representative Stiff.
Mr. Speaker, just a question for the bringer of the amendment. If you could just explain one more time exactly how the spending policy amount changes and the practical effect of that. It looks like the spending policy amount is being changed from 5% to 5.5%. And if the bringer could provide an example of how that plays out and what it means. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other member for their first time? Representative Chairman Flitner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if the bringer of the amendment could just clarify, because I have a very simple brain, does this create yet another pot of savings with this amendment?
Any other member for their first time? Third reading amendment number 1 to House Joint Resolution 3. Member for their first time, going to second time. Any member for their second time before the sponsor. Second time, Representative Hallinan, or did you want to speak to the amendment? Any other member for their second time? Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't really have any problem with the concept of the bill. I just think it would be very difficult for the people to understand it and vote for it. And that's the reason I'd be against this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other member for their second time? Second time to the sponsor, Chairman Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and members, thanks for all the great questions. I try to run down these. These funds are in Violet. That question was brought up. And so those earnings are in the Common School Permanent Land Fund corpus. And really what this kind of starts moving us to is what Utah has done, Alaska, other states, and they have inside their permanent funds these massive reserve accounts. We can only guarantee you about 2 times, right? So we can carry this out about 3 years or so. Utah's 12 times. And because we know the stock market doesn't always boom. Some years you're going to lose money. It's about 6.5, 7 years. We gain the spending policy. We hit the 5%. But then there's those 3 years you don't. And that's why you have these reserve accounts, because we want to accomplish number one, consistent, sustainable flow of earnings for expenditure over time. And so that's why you set this out. This was originally called the Harvard or the Yale model. And, but now we're moving where these things have changed over the last 20, 25 years when the legislature first set this up. So they are in Violet, and that's that point. This amendment does not change the SPA to the good representative from Sweetwater. That is a legislative prerogative, but this says, say the legislature someday says, we want a 10% SPA. Well, this says in the Constitution, no, we can only guarantee up to 5.5, puts a ceiling at it. If the legislature reduces the SPA someday, the spending policy amount to 4%, then that would be covered. So that puts a cap in there. And then my friend from Bighorn asked if this is another pot. You're not going to see another box on this flow chart. That little box I drew in there is my little handiwork. And I wanted to make it really small so you could still see that arrow dropping down to the investment earnings. But it's going to be inside that corpus, fully protected and fully invested. That's the key. That is really the key. So we can make our money, we can get, imagine if you earn 1% more off of 4 billion and 8 billion, right? 1% more, 120 million bucks a year, 3/4 of a penny sales tax, just off investment income. So it's just how we really manage our wealth. And then finally, I think my good friend who sponsored this constitutional amendment, the good doctor, he's always the doctor of the day. And, I think it's always a sales and education piece when you're trying to pass a constitutional amendment. It just is. And I think, I'm thinking, how would we sell this with your deal without this amendment? Say, hey, we're gonna take a little bit out of these permanent funds to spend for today. And then it's over though in 6 years. You got 6 years figured out. Or can you say, hey, we're going to do this now to get through this dip of COVID and price wars. By the way, today's price, anyway, but then we're going to set a path for the future. So we see this problem today, but we got our eye on the future, and we're going to try to make our funds work harder, try to avoid cuts to the children of the future and increase taxes in the future. And so I think that's really the sales job. And this is going to be a bigger and bigger part of our financial future. I'm one of these nerds in the legislature that watches the weather in Chicago. Makes a huge difference. Cold Chicago is good for Wyoming. I got people emailing me complaining about a proposal to not raise fuel tax because a certain administration in Washington has raised our gas taxes. High gas taxes are good for Wyoming. Love it when your gas is $2.80, $3 a gallon, because our oil today's tipping right at 60. Hoo-yah, right? And that's a good thing. And so, but that's how we live in this state right now. This will be a lot smoother as this becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. And so appreciate the debate. We're going to have a lot of debates like this over our 10 years of 66. This is just the beginning. But I appreciate your thoughtfulness and ask for your aye on the amendment, and then our 2/3 aye on the joint resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Chairman Harshman. So members, we are voting on third reading amendment number 1 to House Joint Resolution 3. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, no. The amendment is adopted. House and members, so this is a House Joint Resolution, requires a 2/3 vote of the body. So with that, House Joint Resolution 3, having been read 3 separate times, the question is, shall the bill pass? Chief Clerk, please call the roll.
Andrew. Baker. Banks. Bear. Blackburn. Brown. Burkhart. Burt. Clausen. Clifford. Connolly. Crago. Duncan. Eklund. Air. Flitner. Fortner. Gray. Greer. Hallinan. Haroldson. Harshman. Heiner. Henderson. Hunt. Jennings. Kenner.
Aye.
Knapp. Larson Lloyd. Larson Dan. McGuire. McGuire. Martinez. Nyman. Newsom. Nicholas. Oakley. Obermuller. O'Hearn. Olson. Ottman. Paxton. Provenza. Roscoe. Schwartz. Sherwood. Simpson. Summers. Stiff. Stibar. Sweeney. Walters. Washit. Western. Wharf. Williams. Wilson. Winter. Yin. Zwanitzer. Mr. Speaker. McGuire. Closing vote. Are there any changes? Closing vote. The vote is closed. 40 aye, 20 no.
House Joint Resolution 3, having received the affirmative vote of 2/3 of members elected to the House, House Joint Resolution 3 has passed the House. All right, members. So we're going to switch gears a little bit here. We're going to take we're going to stand at ease for about 5 minutes, and I need members to consider doing 2 things. So in your mailboxes and on the counter over here, there are 2 documents. And this will be one for an explanation of the budget. And then 2, as we work the committee of the whole budget this afternoon, we'll go through that. So Chairman Nicholas will take a personal privilege and kind of walk through this document. First, if you want a hard copy that's over on the counter or in your mailbox, excuse me, the summary sheet is on the counter over here. And so let's get those. They were also mailed to you. So let's stand at ease for a few minutes and get gathered up, and then let's come back together. Chairman Nicholas, maybe come up here and we'll get organized here too. Thank you. So members, let's gather back together. This is going to be going to grant the appropriations chairman and vice chairman a privilege of the floor to walk through a overview of the budget process. So that when we get to the committee of the whole on the budget this afternoon, you'll have some familiarity of the basis for the discussion. We are also looking to have the presentation on the screen up front and available to the public as well. So we're just waiting a moment for that technology to get kicked in. I think we have a screen sharing. We're up now. So Chairman Nicholas, Vice Chairman Larson, the floor is yours.
Yeah, privilege of the floor.
Please proceed. And members, there will be an opportunity to ask questions as after the presentation is over or this afternoon as we come back together. So please proceed, Chairman Nicholas.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, what we are going to do on this privilege is kind of walk through, in essence, how we got to where we are today on the budget that we're going to present to you this afternoon. Just kind of an explanation of the numbers and what we did in a general term and kind of about 30,000 feet so you can understand as we get into the budget and to the summary sheet, you'll have a how we got there, and how we got to those numbers and how this thing evolved over time. So the first thing I want from a very big picture, I want you to think about this. So when we left the legislature last March, we had a $2.97 billion general fund budget. And remember, all we're going to do today is all general fund. We're not dealing with education. We're just dealing with the general fund and whether or not it's balanced or not. When we left in March of last year, we had a balanced budget because we're required basically to kick out a balanced budget. So we had one. And then the COVID showed up. And then by the time we got to May, and then after May, we went to an $877 million deficit. Means actually it was closer to $1 billion deficit because of the statutory reserve amount and what comes out. So basically a $1 billion shortfall, and we had to make up for that and do certain things. So what I'm going to do with this handout is going to walk through those scenarios and help explain it. So when you have questions about this as we present it, please write them down because if we have time, we'll answer as many questions as we can before the lunch hour, and we'll try to get through this by the lunch hour. And just so you know, this same presentation and explanation is being put on by the good Senate Appropriations Chair and Vice Chair down in the other chambers because it's a mirror bill and we're working on the same process. So and it's a little bit more background. In 1560, the budget, the standard budget, and what we passed through the legislature was $3.5 billion. So $3.5 billion. Last year, it was 2.9, right? 2.97. So roughly between 2015-16 to last year, it was a $500 million reduction over the course of about four or 5 years. And what we've just done now with this new budget we're presenting to you is another $500 million reduction because you'll see that our budget now is going to be about $2.52 billion. So what that means is since 15-16, that's about a $1 billion cut in general funds for state government. And ladies and gentlemen, that number is remarkable. And it's an important number to understand because we talk about cut to our state budget. Well, folks, literally $1 billion in cuts since 2016. 2017, we had some major cuts. And I was on appropriations when that happened. And our budget went down to $2.9 billion. I don't know if you recall, but Governor Meade, I think I can say that during this process, he came in late June with cuts of about 245, 250 million. Then when it came back to us, we added about another 30 or $40 million in cuts in addition to that. Plus we increased revenues by about, I think, 30 million a year. So total 60 million in order to balance the budget at that reduced amount. Then in 1920, we had a $3.1 billion budget. It's kind of incrementally moving back up, and that brought us to last year and where we're at today. So it's just interesting to see how those numbers flow and where we've been, just to put it in perspective. So let's talk about where we are, and let's go to page 2 on your handout here. So there is what I was talking about. It says end of 2020 budget session, there was a surplus of 40 million. So that's what we left available basically for expenditures, in addition to having a balanced budget. So that's 3/20 of 21, or March, it was a $2.97 million budget. Today, 2.52. So we've dropped that by roughly $450 million of budgetary cuts. And you'll see that number in these next pages. So why did we do that? So if you go to May 2020, on the second box on this list, how did we get to that number of having a shortfall of $877 million? So it's actually pretty simple if you just run the numbers. That was a number that Craig brought to us, and it was based upon a 40% drop in oil production and a 50% drop in oil production and a 50% drop in oil price. You remember there was a time there where oil was actually negative. It also had a 25% drop in the price of natural gas and a 30% reduction in the price of coal, plus a reduction in production of coal. And then finally, it had a 30% drop in the sales tax. But those numbers were all speculative because we didn't know what they are. It wasn't the worst case scenario. That was kind of the medium. If you remember, those were in the special session. They kind of picked, this is the worst, this is the best, and this 877 was down the middle of the road. The worst case scenario is more like a $1.5 billion deficit in the general funds. I mean, thank goodness that didn't happen, but that's the number we were working with. And then also, you'll see there was no reserve account. The statutory reserve account is 5% of the general fund. And so that's roughly about 113 million that we expended to cover that deficit. So even though it says 177 million, it was really $1 billion because you have to add the 113 to that number. That's how much we were below in our forecasted revenues from March to the end of May. I mean, it's really remarkable. It's the biggest drop in state government in our history. Boom, just like that. So then what happened, because I think it's important to explain to people how these numbers fluctuated so much. And so now if you go to the second box, that's October Craig 2020. And so now all of a sudden we go from an 877 million shortfall to $112 billion shortfall. And that's confusing to a lot of people. It's confusing to us. So we're trying to understand where that number came from. So what happened when Craig met, they took that 50% reduction in oil, both in production and price, and changed it. It ended up being 38% drop in production and about a 26% drop in price. And so that shifted the needle part of it. Yeah, moving it up. On the gas side, they went from 25% to a 15%. And so, boom, and actually a 10% in production, 15% in price. So that moved it up another notch. And why did we? The fact is we just had better numbers by this time. Plus we had the CARES Act relief funds dollars and props up of PPP and all those kind of things. And so the draw that would have happened but for that didn't happen. The greater fallout in the oil and gas and coal markets. So that, and literally it was a prop up in a sense, but it worked. At least that's what they tell us. And then with coal, it was only an 18% shift instead of 30%. And on sales tax, it was a 22% reduction versus 30%. You add all those together, and then the next thing you do is you have to add in the governor's actions. And we're going to talk about those actions and how much they are on the next page. But all those combined literally brought back in $750 million to shore up where we were at. And then you go to the next box. This is Craig of February 8th, 2021. Now we're back to a surplus of 143 million with a full reserve account and using the 1% severance. Remember the 1% severance, that's roughly 128 million, I believe. And so it's just a number to help prop up that we put out there to help cover the deficit. But it's a world of difference from May of 2020. And then go to the last box. And this is what you were presented in our budget when it was initially presented to us. After we made the cuts, we had a surplus of 16 million with a full statutory reserve. So that's the 113 million and no use of a severance tax. So we were able to take that 128 million and pull it back up. The reason, because we continue to have, as you've all seen, we've had an increase in the price of oil and increase in gas, and our sales tax has been continuing to improve. So each one of those numbers are based upon what's just transpired on those major accounts through time. So let's go then to the next page. Here's what the governor's actions were in the step one. I think it's important to kind of break these down in so we understand what the governor did right out of the get-go. He froze positions, large contracts, and that is actually still going on today. Those actions that he took in terms of freezing positions and large contracts, he's still imposing that restriction. And you can see that that resulted in reversions we didn't expect and higher anticipated revenues. And that was his step ones, basically, that he did instantly. That happened in April, late April, as soon as this went into effect. And then, as you recall, he instituted step two. And he imposed this as the chief executive of the state of Wyoming when he saw this $877 million shortfall. He had to do something. I mean, it's similar to what, once again, Governor Meade did back in 16, 17. So what he did is he imposed a 10% cut to all general fund agencies and had them present that to their budget. And he started it July 1. So it went into immediate effect. And you'll see as we get down a little lower, every agency is different. The amount of general funds they have versus federal funds and the type of services that or how they use those dollars. Because some of the general fund dollars, some agencies just couldn't make the cuts, by the way, because they're all personnel. And we'll talk about that later and during our budget presentation. But for example, the court system. Court system is 96 to 97% personnel. So to make a 10% cut, the only way you could do it was to let someone go. Well, the average district court has 3 employees. The district court judge is a statutory amount of fees, so you only have 2 places to cut, administrator and your court reporter. And if you cut them, you can't do your job. So that they just couldn't sustain those kind of cuts. So so each agency is different, and you'll have the opportunity when we walk through the budget to talk about those agencies that you have questions about and where those cuts are and how they landed. And we'll try to explain what the governor did and then what we did when we reviewed all the governor's work and came up with this budget. So that 10% cut resulted in a $335 million reduction in our general fund expenditures. And so that's step two. And we'll talk about this a little bit. And as we go through, you might ask more questions about it. But it's important to know that major maintenance is the total amount of cuts ended up being 15%. Of that 15%, 11% is really general funds. The other 4% is swapping major maintenance out of general fund dollars and covering it with SIPA dollars. And so normally SIPA is one-time construction. We said, this is an emergency. We're going to use the SIPA to cover major maintenance. And the governor reduced major maintenance from a 2% of the replacement value of those properties to 1.5%. And it was just a mechanism because then it went from 130, roughly 130 million, maybe 120 million, down to 97 million to cover all the major maintenance for all state buildings. And then the governor directed the agencies to do another 10% cut. But remember that this is only for 1 year because we only have 1 year remaining in the biennium. So if you look at that step 3, that's 111 million for 1 year of the 10%, and then they had major maintenance rolls back in. And so when the budgets were presented to appropriations, in addition to the 2%, there were recommendations, and you'll see that in the budget books if you looked at them, of the 10% recommendations that the agencies were supposed to present. And then what the governor went in and he looked at those, and some of them he said, yeah, this is okay. Some of them he said, particularly law enforcement and certain other things that he didn't want to cut. He says, well, you don't have to take the full or any of that step 3 cuts because you just can't do it for whatever reason. And once again, that's what we'll walk through when we present the budget. So let's go to step 4, page 4. And this talks about more specifically what I just talked about. So the governor's recommendations was a step 2 and step 3, a total of a 15% cuts, which is 11% without major maintenance. And so that number, that 15% is $446 million. If you add in major maintenance, without major maintenance, it's 350 million, all that combined. And then there you can see no reductions in law enforcement and public safety. We'll talk a little bit more about major maintenance as when we present the budget, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The biggest impact is SIPA versus general fund dollars. And there's the 1% severance tax. So what is OFSTA? OFSTA, and I think I described it the other day, but OFSTA is the 1%. So we have a 1.5% that we automatically grab, and that goes into the permanent mineral trust fund. Then there's additional 1%, which is we call the severance tax, that for the past 4.5 years, roughly, we've grabbed that 120 million. It was a little less over time. We've grabbed that in order to pay the operations of government, because in order to balance our budget. And during the debates between the House and the Senate appropriations, basically that OFSTA money was going to go 50% to the LSRA, 50% to the Permanent Mineral Trust Fund. And we said, wait a minute, let's hold this money in abeyance. We'll put it in the OFSTA account. We created the OFSTA account in case we need it, because it's not probably the right time to throw that into the permanent funds or Lizard right now, because we just didn't know what's going to happen. And so again, in this budget cycle, we said, and this was one of those, basically, this is one of those cram down situations where we have 7, they have 5. They wanted to have it distributed into those accounts, and we said, not yet. We don't know what's going to happen. If we have another fall, if something happens, we want to have this money available. So it is in this account in our budget, and can be available for the rest of the biennium, depending on what we do here and what they do down there and what we do in conference committee. Okay, so that's that page. Let's go to page 5. So what is this? I think it's kind of self-explanatory, but let's take number 1, because it can be confusing. So these are what the actual cuts were to each agency. And you can see that on the far right, percent total reductions to the general fund dollars. Well, some of this it's confusing because there's not enough data on this page to explain it. The governor took a full 15% cut to his budget, but it says 6.22%. You see that in there? Well, so why does it say that? Well, the Appropriations Committee added back in 1.25 million for coal port litigation on the West Coast. And so that's because that's in his budget and we added it back to it, it appears that he didn't take the full cuts of 15%. And that's our doing, it's not the governor's doing. And frankly, the coal port litigation probably ought to be in either a CAPCON, but more likely in a section 300 in the budget instead of in his budget, but that's where it landed. And so, but what's interesting about this, if you go to this third column from the right, you'll see pluses and minuses between what their actual total amount of cuts were and what they weren't. So why is it, I mean, it's confusing to me when you look at it. So Office of the Governor, you can see his total reductions were 826. But then it goes, then you move to the next column, you see the 321,000. Well, that's us putting back dollars. And so there are plus and minuses, and those plus and minuses are different for each agency because different agencies took different actions in order to get their 15% or whatever percent they were at. Some of them substituted federal dollars for it. A good example is Homeland Security. Homeland Security basically took two positions and found federal dollars to fill those positions and then eliminated those positions out of the general fund. And so that's how they achieved their cuts. And you'll see, and it's really interesting, some agencies were very clever and actually almost too clever. They're just moving balls around and they're not getting any real cuts at all. And the appropriations, I mean, that was not our preference. And we took certain actions on certain agencies to increase their cuts, basically, just to make it more fair and to not just hide the ball. And we'll go through that this afternoon when we walk through each of those budgets, so if you have questions on it. But if you then look at the next page, you'll see that the total average cuts, because it's totaled up at the bottom, is 15% across all agencies, roughly. Of course, and just remember that's major maintenance is included in that number. So I'm not going to walk through each one of those. I've got some examples of them, but I think it's easier as we cover that as we go. So let's go to page 7, because this will kind of then explains what we did with the governor's recommendations. So all told, out of $447 million in cuts, we were only different by about $1.5 million. What does that mean? Well, that means as a practical matter, we adopted the Gov's recs. He did a good job at what he did. He did it in a responsible fashion, and he presented to us a balanced budget. And so we commend the governor on his actions, and this is proof in the pudding that we think he did the right job and that he picked the right amounts for most agencies. You will see a joint appropriations amendment come as a second reading amendment where we actually add dollars back into basically healthcare services because we actually think he went too far. And we'll explain why he went too far. But what happened was because of the haste of just telling every agency and every division to cut step 2 and step 3, what they didn't do is a kind of a fine-tooth analysis of what those impacts were. And I'll just take disability waivers as an example. If you have the way that the cuts work, some of those providers took a 50 to 60% cut because just because there's a nick here, nick here, nick here, if all part of that 15%, basically it puts people out of business. And we said, wait a minute, we need to go back. And so we kind of did a hard analysis on that. And you'll see an amendment that brings in back roughly about $31 million to address those types of things that we said, this is just a bridge too far. And more importantly, there are dollars to cover it. And I'll talk about that right at the end. But so general fund additional $1.5 million in cuts that we put in. We also modified how he used SIPA dollars. And because as you heard in the governor's state of the state that he kind of wants to get rid of the SIPA. Well, the House Appropriations does not want to get rid of SIPA. It has a specific purpose and it has a need. And our position is if it goes away, then basically, and you have one general fund with those dollars into it, then those needs won't be met. And we as a body have the tendency to spend whatever's in the checking account. And our position is, then let's just not put quite so much money in the checking account because we won't spend so much. And we'll take care of one-time expenditures like I talked about in Capcom and use SIPA dollars. But when we do that, it's one time. And if we don't have the dollars You don't have the dollars and we don't build anything. But if you have the dollars, then that's a good place to put one-time dollars. Are we ready for a break? All right. I guess I don't get to finish by, you're going to have to listen to me after lunch. I'm sorry. Okay, and then after that, you'll see the school foundation program. This was our majority floor leaders kind of task as we were doing this. We grabbed all of the foundation dollars that we could that was out there around in different places just over time and pulled them back in to help shore up and fund the school foundation program. Came to about $3.1 million, but and obviously we know why we did that because of our pending educational deficits. So with that, we'll resume this at 2 o'clock and shouldn't take too much more longer, probably another 15 or 20 minutes, my guess is. So, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Nicholas. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House stand in recess until 2 p.m.
Committee announcements. Chairman Paxton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee number 4, Education, will meet in E3 in 10 minutes to consider House Bill 63, Early Childhood Education, continuation of that bill. House Bill 165, Wyoming's Tomorrow Scholarship, and House Bill 154, School Finance, School District Reserves.
Chairman Zwanitzer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Committee number 7, Corporations, is going to meet in the Capitol Extension Auditorium in 5 minutes to hear all 4 public health orders bills, including House Bill 98, 113, 127, and House Bill 56.
Chairman Burkhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your committee number 8, Transportation, will meet tomorrow upon noon adjournment to consider House Bill 172, Veterans Property Tax Exemption, House Bill 190, Vehicle Titles for Non-Resident Owners, and House Bill 241, Fees for Oversize and Overweight, loads.
Thank you. Any other announcements? Any other announcements? Chairman Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Your House today on adjournment in room 301. We'll hear House Bill 132, 164, and the continuation of House Bill 142 and re-referrals.
Thank you. Any other announcements?
Yeah, one more. I'm sorry, Mr. I want
Please
to announce
continue.
For tomorrow, on Tuesday, March 9th at 8 a.m. in room 301, we'll hear House Bill 125, 158, 195, and 242.
Thank you. Any other